It's a blessing to be with you today, and I have to be honest with you. I have mixed emotions because I wish, in a way, we could have ended with that lesson. Because I'm disturbed, I'm challenged, I'm convicted, and I really feel like I need to go away and think and pray, get on my knees, and just kind of process a lot of the things that we heard in that lesson. So it's a little difficult actually doing this after that because my mind has really been stirred and I'm thinking about those things. But then as I think about it, if we're facing a world and a culture that is as it's been described, and if we are called and challenged to live faithfully in the face of that sort of opposition, how important is it going to be for us to actually listen to God? How important is it going to be for us to be deeply involved in His Word and make sure that we're actually hearing what He's telling us? It's one thing to read the Bible. It's one thing to read what people say about the Bible. It's one thing to read the Bible and think, well, this is what I think it says. This is what I think it means. But are we really listening to God? Could it be possible that God might be telling us something in His Word that we're missing? And if we think of the Bible as a blueprint, I don't know about you, I've looked at lots of blueprints and I'm not trained to read blueprints. And so when I see a blueprint, I really can't tell a whole lot. If the Bible is our blueprint, don't we need to learn to read that blueprint? There are some things that can help us a great deal in learning to read and understand the Bible. And the reason why that's important is because the Bible is God's message to us. It's God's way of speaking to us. And when we read that message, that book, whatever it is we're reading, maybe it's the book of Philippians or the book of Ruth or the book of Romans or whatever it might be, we want to make sure that we're really hearing what God says. And so what I want to share with you today are some things that I have learned and been blessed to learn over the years that kind of work as clues to help in understanding the Bible. And I've got a lot of stuff, and I won't be able to go over all of it in detail. I will start, let's look at the page that says General Bible Study Recommendations. This is just kind of an overview. It's not all encompassing. It's just some suggestions on how to approach the Bible. Of course, we want to start by praying and asking for wisdom and understanding. That's number one. And here are some very practical suggestions. Number two, I want to challenge you, okay? Spend an entire year with one book of the Bible. And you may think, well, how in the world can I spend a whole year studying a book of the Bible? Well, the best thing you can do with a book of the Bible for a year is read that book. Don't read books about that book. Read that book. Read that book over and over and over and over and over and over again. Listen to what God is saying through the author of that book as you read it. Have your eyes open, your spiritual ears open, your heart open. Read it and read it and read it and listen to what God is saying. As you read, you're going to notice a lot of things that you didn't notice the first time. I read a really good story the other day I want to use because it really, I think, illustrates the importance of this. One of the most important parts of good Bible study and really hearing God's message is learning to be observant. Read the book. Observe what's there. I read about a guy the other day who went to graduate school, I believe it was at Vanderbilt University, and he was going to major in science, and he was very excited about this science professor that was there. He was pretty renowned. He was looking forward to taking class under him. He went in his first day, the first day of class, went into a lab, and the professor brought out this big bottle with a fish, a dead fish in it, preserved in some kind of solution. I don't know what it was. This was some years ago. And the professor reaches in the bottle, pulls out the fish, lays it on the table, and he says, "Look at the fish." And he leaves. And so the guy's looking at the fish, trying to observe everything he can about the fish, and the professor's gone for an hour or two. And, after the first 15 minutes, he thought he'd seen everything he could about a fish. But he kept looking, because that's what the professor said to do. And so, after a couple of hours, the professor comes back in. He says, "Tell me what you've observed about the fish." And he told him the obvious things. Well, it has gills, and it's got fins, and all these different things, that you would see when you first start looking at a fish. He said, "You really haven't looked at the fish. You need to observe the fish some more. Look at the fish." So he went away. And he was gone. He didn't come back. It was lunchtime by then, and the guy was kind of relieved because he thought, well, at least I have a good reason to stop looking at this fish. I can go eat lunch. And he went to lunch, came back. Fish was still there, and the professor's instructions ringing in his ears. So he kept looking at the fish. And he looked and he looked. Hours went by. Finally, the professor comes back and he says, "Tell me what you have observed about the fish." Well, he had observed a little bit more, and he shared that with the professor, but he said, "You really have not seen some very obvious things about this fish. I want you to look at the fish." So he looked at the fish. The end of the day comes. Finally, he's able to go home and get some relief from looking at that fish. And comes back the next day. First thing the professor wants him to do is to look at the fish. So all the next day, he has to observe that fish. He's looking at it. All of a sudden, after a while, he begins seeing things on that fish that he'd never seen before. Never would have seen them if he hadn't just kept looking at the fish. So, make a long story short, he did finally see what the professor wanted him to see. He made observations about the fish that he never would have seen had he not just kept looking and kept looking and kept looking. That's what we need to do with Scripture. That's why it's good to choose a book, spend a period of time with it, if not a year, 6 months. The best thing you can do is read it over and over and over and over again. And have a conversation with the author. Listen to the author. Ask him questions. Why did you say that? And why did you say that right here in this particular place? What do you mean by that? Where are you going with this? What's your main point? What's your main theme? What's your main idea? What are you wanting me to do as a result of reading this book? And you're reading and you're reading and you're reading and you're listening and you're listening. And it's like the guy looking at that fish. The more you look, the more you're going to see. And finally, you will hear what God is really saying in that book. That's probably the main thing I want to tell you this morning, is challenge you with that, to be observant, pay attention, and read, 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 read. Number 6, watch for clues that are listed on the opposite page. And I want you to turn to the opposite page. And we're not going to have time to spend much time on all these things, but let me tell you something. If you've been trained to read a blueprint, you will do a better job reading the blueprint and doing what the blueprint is designed for you to do with it. If you've been trained to look at a fish, you'll be able to see more on a fish than someone who's untrained. But let me tell you this, even if you're trained, you still need to look at that fish. You still need to be in the Word, because God has things to say to you that you may have missed. And I don't care if you studied a book for 30 years. You come back to it 30 years later, you still need to read it and let God speak to you through that book. The clues, the sheet says enriching your Bible study, clues that help. These are clues that ancient writers used. Some of them we still use today, but these are clues that ancient writers used basically to help guide us so that as we read, and they would have heard it first, it would have been read out loud. These are rhetorical devices designed to be heard initially, but also put into writing. They become literary devices. And if you know what to look for, and you're observant, then you're going to see things that you would not see if you didn't know what to look for. These are some of the things that jump out if you know what to look for. And they're very, very helpful because they're what the writer uses to guide our thoughts so that we see and perceive and understand what they're trying to say, where they're going, what their point is, what they want us to do. All of that is their way of trying to help us not to miss the point. So let's look at some of them. Most basic thing probably is that most books of the Bible are divided up into 3 parts. This is very simple, but very meaningful. You have an opening, a middle, and a closing. May not work in every book, but most books are that way. The importance of that is the function of it. The function of it is, in the opening part, the writer will tell us what's important that he's going to talk about. He'll develop that part in the middle of the book. And in the closing part of the book, he'll summarize that and drive it home one more time. So you'll see that in most of the books of the Bible you read. When I look at a book, I often read the opening and the closing first, so that I have a little bit of a clue what he's planning to talk about. And then I see if it's still at the end, so I have a better idea of what's the most important thing. Then I go back and read the whole thing. But that 3-part structure can be very helpful. Sometimes the writers help us and they just come out and tell us why they're writing a book. They give an explicit statement of purpose, like the Gospel of John, chapter 20 and 21. He talks about the signs in the book of John, many other signs Jesus did in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book, but these are written for a purpose, right? So that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. So when we read the Gospel of John, we need to read it with that purpose in mind. That's why he wrote the book. He told us. So we go back and reread chapter 3, whatever verse it is. We want to read chapter 3 with that purpose in mind because it affects how we understand the details in chapter 3. Anytime we can get a sense of the purpose, the reason why a book is written, what the writer's trying to get us to do as a result of writing that book, it helps us to understand the individual parts that we want to understand as we go through. In narrative type material where stories are told, like the Gospels and a lot of Old Testament material, summary statements are used. And I'm going to give examples of these in a moment. I'm just kind of quickly going through them. Summary statements where a writer will summarize what he's just said and oftentimes will introduce what he's about to say. And what they're trying to do is guide us as we read the book to follow their train of thought. Okay, we'll look at some examples in a moment. Framing. A lot of times if you read a book enough and you're observant enough and you're looking for it, you will see words, phrases, and clauses that are repeated. And a lot of times that repetition is purposeful because what it does is it helps us to see what verses or what chapters go together as a thought unit and what that unit of thought is about. So you'll have a word here and a word here, or a phrase here and a phrase here, and everything in between is about that word or that phrase. And if you know that, as you read all those verses and chapters in between, it makes a lot more sense. Maybe I should start looking at some examples here instead of just going through all these. Let's turn to Philippians, the book of Philippians, for an example. I haven't gotten to it yet, but about halfway down the page there's a name called Thanksgivings and Prayers. Most letters in the New Testament have a thanksgiving prayer. Not all of them, but most of them do. Very significant in a letter, if there's a thanksgiving prayer, that you notice that thanksgiving prayer, because that's where the writer reveals his main theme as a general rule. Especially if there's a prayer. If there's a prayer, that's where the writer will tell us what he's really writing about. What's his main idea? Look at Philippians chapter 1. If you look at verse 1 through verse 11, you have a prescript at the beginning. You have a thanksgiving prayer that ends in verse 11. And I want you to look at the prayer, verse 9. I pray this, that your love may abound even more and more in knowledge and every kind of insight, so that you can decide what is best. Now, some translations there will have, so that you can discern what really matters. And I like that better. The book of Philippians is written for the specific purpose. The main idea is to help us to come where we can discern things in the Christian life that really matter. And we were talking about that in the sermon today. A lot of bad things can happen in our life. But if bad things happen to us, what is it that really matters? That's what Paul's dealing with in this letter. And he tells us right there. So as we read everything we read, all the individual verses, all the chapters, all the things that go together, we have to keep in mind what he's talking about is what really matters. And as you go through, by the way, verse 12, I'll just mention, is one of the clues on our list. It's called a disclosure formula. And it's translated usually with a verb of desire, an infinitive verb that follows it that means to know, plus the content of what he wants us to know. Look at chapter 1, verse 12. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that my situation has actually turned out to advance the gospel. Now, the disclosure formula is helpful in several ways. It helps you to know where the opening ends and the middle begins. Lots of letters, the body or the middle starts with a disclosure formula. The disclosure formula also reveals to you the topic of the middle of the body. So what Paul is really writing about in Philippians has something to do with his situation and how what is happening to him has actually served to advance the gospel. Now, what's his situation? He's in prison, is he not? That's where he is. What is his main concern? I want you to be able to discern what it is that really matters. What really matters, if you're a Christian and you're suffering, maybe you're in prison, is, and if you go through and look at what Paul has to say, look at verse 13 and 14. This is how the gospel is being advanced as a result of his imprisonment. The whole imperial guard, everyone else, knows that I'm in prison for the sake of Christ, and most of the brethren have confidence, or being made confident in the Lord because of my imprisonment. Now, more than ever, they dare to speak the word fearlessly. If you go on in verses 15 to 8, we don't have time to read all of it, but in essence, what happens is, Paul makes the point that, yes, I'm in prison. Yes, that's maybe not the most desirable thing that could happen to you. But that's not what really matters. What really matters is that if I'm in prison, the gospel is preached and people are saved. That's what matters. That's what we need to keep in mind. And he goes on and he talks about other situations and other people. And he even talks about the Philippian Christians themselves who are suffering. And a lot of what Paul's doing in the book of Philippians, and again, if you read and read and read and read, one of the things you're going to notice is that a lot of the things he says have to do with the way you think, your mindset, your attitude, your thought processes. And he's trying to get us to change the way we think about the things that happen to us, to change the way we think about our circumstances. And so you keep reading, and he gives examples of people who get it, who really are able to discern what it is that really matters. And you come to chapter 2, and the supreme example that he gives is the example of Jesus. I won't go into that, although I'd like to. If you keep going through, you come to chapter 4. By the way, let's see here. I can see this. Well, I don't at the moment. Go to chapter 4. Look at verse 2. There's another clue that's on our list. It's translated in my translation here, I appeal to Euodia and to Syntyche to agree in the Lord. Yes, I say also to you, true companion, help them. And the clue is the word appeal. You may have it translated, I exhort, I encourage, I urge, I beg, I plead, I appeal, something of that sort. That is a rhetorical device used for the purpose of getting our attention. And guess what it reveals? It reveals to us what the writer wants us to do as a result of reading the book. What is his main purpose in writing this letter? It has to do with two ladies in the church who are not getting along. The main reason Paul wrote Philippians is to help these two ladies to come back together again in their service to the Lord and help them to be able to discern what is it that really matters. You can see how it begins to all fit together. There's also something else going on in Philippians, and that has to do with Paul's support. Philippi had been one of his staunchest supporters, and apparently that support had stopped. If you look at the beginning and the ending of the letter, it becomes obvious that part of the reason he's writing is to deal with that issue. They had stopped their support, recently started it again, but there was doubt about whether or not they ought to be supporting him, which you can imagine would be reasonable because, here he is, an apostle, supposed to be a man of God. Why in the world would he be in prison? Why would God do that to him? Why is God making us suffer? That's not what really matters, Paul says. What matters is that, the gospel is preached, people are saved, and that these two ladies come back in together into unity so that they can function to help spread the gospel. And as far as his support goes, it doesn't really matter to him whether they support him or not. He says, I know how to be content whether I have a lot or nothing. It doesn't really matter. What matters is the gospel is preached and people are saved. And so you have, in this particular book, you have that Thanksgiving prayer that gives us the main theme. You have the disclosure formula in verse 12, transitions us to the middle of the book where he begins to discuss the theme that he brings up in the opening. He gives the topic of the body that he follows through that's related to that main theme. He gives us the behavioral objective, chapter 4, verse 2, in that request formula, appeal formula, verses 2 and 3. And then you get to the closing of the book, And guess how you tell where you're moving from the middle to the closing in Philippians? Look at the word finally. Now, he kind of messes you up a little bit because he says that once before, but he didn't really mean it. It's kind of like a preacher. You get to chapter 4, verse 8. Finally, here we come to the end. And look what he talks about. Whatever is true, whatever is worthy of respect, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if something is excellent, praiseworthy, if something really matters, think about these things. Focus your thoughts on what really matters. Don't be sidetracked by your circumstances. Don't be sidetracked by what's happening to me. What matters is the gospel is preached and people are saved. And so it all comes out as you read and as you learn to observe these sorts of clues. I want to go to a hard book and let you see how it works, okay? I hope you have your Bibles open. Go to the book of Romans. The reason I say it's a hard book, and I'm not going to get into this a lot, but if you read 99 commentaries out of 100, they're going to tell you that the main theme of Romans is justification by faith in verses 16 and 17 of Romans. They'll tell you that's the thematic statement. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God to save everybody. That is definitely an important part of Romans, but is it the main theme, and how do we tell? Is that what God is telling us? That's the point. It's not what I think. It's not what some commentator thinks. It's what is God trying to say, and how do we discern that? Let's look. Remember how we said the opening part is where he reveals his main idea? The middle part is where he develops his main idea. The closing part is where he summarizes and finishes up his thoughts. So it might be helpful to us to know where the opening ends and the middle begins, because if we're looking for the main idea, we want to look in the opening, not in the middle. Well, Paul makes it very, very clear. If you're reading down and you're reading and you're looking and you're observing and you know what to look for, when you get to verse what? Do you see a disclosure formula? I do not want you to be ignorant or unaware or unknowing. Chapter 1, verse 13. That is a technical device Paul is using to tell us I'm transitioning from opening to middle. Where do we usually find the main idea? It's in the opening part in a Thanksgiving prayer. And so if you read the opening part, you get to verse 8. There you start with his thanksgiving. Verse 10, you get down to his prayer. I always ask in my prayers, if perhaps now at last I may succeed in coming to you by the will of God, according to the will of God. For I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to strengthen you. Now this may seem really strange, but what Paul is telling us is his main idea in the book of Romans has to do with praying that God will somehow help him to succeed in coming to Rome. Well, that doesn't seem very spiritual. But let's follow it and see if it's true. If that's the main idea, when we get over to the closing, we ought to see it again. Let's go to the closing. Happens to start in chapter 15. And if we had more time, I would have you doing this and looking yourself. And somebody keep me posted on time, because I don't know what's happening. Okay. What time do we end? Oh, okay. When you get to chapter 15, verse 14, I myself am fully convinced about you. This is another rhetorical device that I didn't put on the list that denotes his moving into his closing part. He talks about how he's written to them boldly about being a minister for the gospel of Christ to the Gentiles. And he keeps going, and as he keeps going, he talks about how he talks about obedience. He talks about verse 22, "This is the reason I have often been hindered from coming to you, but now there's nothing more to keep me in these regions. And for many years I've desired to come to you. When I go to Spain, I hope to visit you when I pass through, that you might be able to help me on my journey there, after I've enjoyed your company for a while." And to make this shorter than it should be, I think the book of Romans really should be understood as a missionary fundraising letter. You ever looked at it that way? Well, you never would unless you read it, and know what to look for. He wants to come to Rome. The reason he wants to come to Rome is because he's not preached the gospel there. He hasn't preached the gospel there because his modus operandi is to preach the gospel in places where others haven't preached. But he wants Rome to be his headquarters, his support for when he goes to Spain. And it's important for the people in Rome to understand the gospel that he's going to preach when he goes to Spain. That's why you have all the stuff in between where he talks about the gospel. Chapter 1, beginning in verse 16, by the way, has the word "for." Verse 17 has "for." That is explanatory of what he's already said. He says, I want to come to Rome. Pray that I will be able to come to Rome. And then the reason why is because I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's God's power to save. It saves the Jew first and the Greek. And on he goes. He's also dealing with a practical problem in Rome that we don't have time to get into. They were judging each other. And so he talks about the Jews and the Gentiles and how they need each other and how God's working through both groups, how they need to come together. And you can't have a church that's healthy that will support you in Spain if the church is at odds with each other. So he's dealing with that issue too. Let's see. I guess I'll leave these other things for you to read and think about yourself. The point is, there are clues that the writers themselves give us that guide us in how they are thinking and where they're going and how we can follow them there and get to the right destination. And so the clues are very helpful. Watch for those clues. Learn the clues. Watch for the clues. Read over and over and over and over again. Be observant. One of the things I like to do is print out a copy of the whole book where I can spread it out on the table. And I can see it all at once. And as I read, I start marking things on there where I see a word repeated or I see a word repeated numerous times. I'll probably go to my concordance and look it up and see how many times is it used, and is it used in the opening, middle, and closing. That's important if it is. If it's not, it may be important, but it's not the main idea. So as I go through and as I'm observing things, I'm looking things up and making notes on this sheet of paper, but I want to see the whole thing out in front of me. And I often do that. The other sheet, as we close, is a bibliography. It's not exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination, but they're books that can be helpful to you. I found that book by George Guthrie to be very refreshing and useful. He goes and he interviews experts in different genres of the Bible. And they talk about how to understand that particular type of literature. It's very insightful. Debbie, did you want to say something?
We're running out of time. Do you have things on your website?
My website is not functioning, no. If you want to write down my email address and you have questions or my phone number or whatever, it's Charlie Powell, Charlie, Powell 286. Charlie Powell 286 at gmail.com. And my phone number, 406-4768. 406-4768. And I'd be glad to share. I've got a lot more things that I could share. The websites that I have down, there's online resources there, Bible study software. Man, I wish I could say more about all this stuff. Just don't have time. On the back of that sheet, steps for serious Bible study. If you want to do a serious study, pick a book of the Bible, stick with it for a year, follow the steps on that serious study. There's a book there that I've recommended that will help you to do that. And so, I've got to stop. I feel like I haven't really finished what I need to finish, but we're out of time. So, I appreciate greatly your interest in reading and studying the Word. The Word, folks, is our life, our sustenance. It's our spiritual food. It's not just a blueprint. We have to have it to live. And if we don't eat, we will die. And especially when the pressure gets hard, if we're not eating good food, we're going to die. This is important stuff. It's important that we listen to God, that we learn to hear His voice. That's what I'm appealing with you today about. And hopefully have given you some things that might be useful in hearing God in a better way. So thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Isn't that right there? As a Christian, we study worship. We don't always understand. We're afraid that He'll enlighten our mind to show us the way we should understand the Scriptures. Have them listen to Him. We want to learn more, but we're slow learners sometimes.
Boy, aren't we, though? Yeah. Yep. That's how we have to stay at it, because we may not hear Him the first time, and we may not want to hear it the first time, or the second time, or the third time. It may be the sixth time before it finally gets through to us.